Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome back into the studio. Today we are going to be talking about how a piece goes from the blocking stage to a more refined surface. How to make the surface smooth, or in my case, appear smooth from a distance. In many ways, it's the finishing step. As long as everything has been set up well, this will be the final thing that you do to your sculpture. We're obviously not going to finish this sculpture here today, but I'll share this with you since this is what happened to the sculpture in real time. This is what I did at this point in the process. Sometimes it's good to push certain sections of the work forward in order to see if the blocking was good, if the work was headed in a good direction. According to my YouTube analytics, over 75% of you watching this are not subscribed to the channel. If you enjoy my content, want to support the channel and get the most recent upload in your feed so you don't miss it, subscribe to the channel by hitting that little red subscribe button on the bottom right hand side of the video. It's free for you and it helps me out a lot. Let me begin by talking about the tools I will use during this episode. Tools get sometimes a little bit too much credit. What tools you use doesn't really matter too much, but I'll explain which ones I like and perhaps you can try them out and see how they work for you. I have 3 tools that I like and use for the most part during the entire process. That's a wood tool for applying clay, a rake tool for removing clay, and a loop tool to smooth the clay. The wood tool is a simple wooden spatula from Tiranti, nothing special. I have a few different sizes of the same tool, and depending on the scale or area that I'm working in, I'll use the appropriately sized tool for the job. Different sized tools might give you slightly different result as far as surface texture goes. The wood tool is for applying clay, and in regards to finishing a sculpture, the 2 goals that's associated with adding clay is to either soften the transition between the 2 forms, or adding volume to a form so it appears fuller, thicker, and less flat or deflated. The rake tool is a metal wire with teeth cut into it and inserted into a wooden handle. My preferred brand for these tools is Sculpture House. The teeth of the rake tool do a better job of evenly removing clay from the surface than a smooth loop tool does. I use the rake to remove clay if I've added too much by mistake, which does happen from time to time, and I use it to smooth or subtle down a surface. Think of it like sandpaper on wood. First you need a rougher sandpaper to get rid of the big imperfections. That's the rake tool. Then you'll move to a finer sandpaper in order to get rid of marks left by the rough sandpaper. The rake tool does a fantastic job of making forms seem organic and rounded, and I use it a lot for this purpose. However, it does remove clay, so I rarely let the rake tool have the final say, as I prefer the freshness and bounce adding clay gives the surface as my final touch. But that's a personal preference. The final tool is a loop tool, which is similar to a rake, except it's a smooth wire with no teeth. All my loop tools are from Kemper Tools. They make excellent quality loop tools, the best in the business, I think. The loop tool is the fine sandpaper of my process. After raking and adding clay over the top, I'll often find areas where the texture is a bit too much for me, and this is when the loop tool goes to work and lightly takes the edge off whatever texture is present. The loop tool is used very selectively, as I'd like some variety in my surface texture. On areas I'd like to be really smooth, however, I'll use this tool a lot. In general, the procedure tends to go a little bit something like this. I'll rake the surface down a bit to make it slightly more even and easier to work. Then I'll go over that with a wood tool and I'll add more clay wherever it is needed, and where it's not needed, I'll use the wood tool to dampen down the rake tool texture. For most areas though, a little addition of clay with a wood tool, even if it's just a millimeter or half a millimeter even, is the way to go, as it adds a lot of life to the sculpture and keeps the work from ever appearing flat and boring. The last step is to pick and choose areas I'd like to be smoother, and I'll go over these areas very lightly with the loop tool. There are some simple rules that I try to abide by as best as I can while doing this type of work. I have these sorts of rules, or guidelines is perhaps a better word for it, that I follow, and they change depending on where I am in the process. I've spoken about many of these before, An example is the 3 rules of blocking in. There might even be a video about the 3 rules of blocking in on the channel that you can check out if you want. But back to the task at hand, the rules that I attempt to abide by while refining the surface. I attempt to follow these, but of course there are exceptions, always keep this in mind. Rule number 1 is, never change the contour or the shape design unless it's with intention. This one pretty much reads, make sure that any changes that you make to anything is intentional. I've worked hard to set up contours from 4 views. Actually, because of the complex twist in the pose and the secondary figure, it's probably closer to 12 views. And I've covered all of that in a previous video on this project. But because of that, I never want to add or remove clay from any of these contours, as they are very well developed high points that I should be using to guide me, not remove or destroy. So, whenever I'm applying clay on the surface or the rake comes into contact with the clay, I think through if the move I'm about to make altered the contours as I set it up while observing on equal terms. If the goal is to progress the piece, it's best, I find, to use what work came before to guide me, what work I did earlier in the process to guide me. I've set up these contours as boundaries to work within. And because I've spent so much time doing so, I can work freely right now, knowing that as long as I stay within the boundaries of the contours that I set up earlier, I should be good to go. The other thing I'd like to maintain is the shape design, or the design of the internal information, if you will. Modeling has a tendency to change your block in unless you are careful. A shape you've set up and designed well might grow outwards as more clay is added in a careless fashion, and before you know it, the shape itself is too big, and the area that should be reserved for the transition disappears. You'll end up with compromised shape design, and it's hard to tell whether work that's unintentional is going to be good or not. It's very random, obviously. Without an area reserved for the transition, the edges between your forms will appear sharp and the figure will appear very tense. You'll probably try to combat this feeling by filling in the transitions to make them softer, but now your figure is going to appear fat. The answer usually lies in the block-in, and respecting said block-in much more than you would think. Modeling has for some reason this kind of magic air about it, but it doesn't have to be very magic or very hard at all. The work that I'm doing on screen today doesn't look that difficult, and it doesn't look that difficult because it isn't. The hard part is getting here so that I can begin this work, and if I've gotten here and done well with my block-in, this part of the process becomes fairly painless. So instead of adding clay in a way that grows the forms and breaks your carefully considered shape design, or bulges out your contours which we established while observing on equal terms, add clay in a way that adds slight volume to the form. Add clay not on the high point because that would break the contour. Don't add clay to the edge of the form because that changes the shape design. Add clay in between these two. This will give the form the volume that it needs to have a full value range all the way from bright light to dark shadows. This will read much better as a finished result. Make sure there is an area between each form reserved for the transition and give the transition its own plane and its own value. A broader transition will give the work a more organic feel and appear much less tense and claustrophobic. Let's take a quick second to talk about how you can support the channel. Subscribing and liking the video is of great help, of course. If you would like to get something more in return for your support, however, head over to my Patreon page. On Patreon, you can watch exclusive content like the Beginner's Guide to Figure Sculpture, which we just completed, and the Portrait series, which we have just started, where I will show you everything you need to know about sculpting a portrait. You can also get personal feedback on your own work from me, or anything you might need help with in your sculpting endeavors. So check it out. There's a link in the description below. The second rule follows along in the very same footsteps. It's about addition of clay and how to deal with forms that appear too sharp. Essentially how to turn two planes into a volume. Rule number 2 is, add clay to either side of a high point instead of grinding down the high point itself. It can be very tempting to use the rake tool or loop tool to take down an edge in order to round a form out. Initially, this will seem like an okay solution, but there is a better solution you should pursue instead. When faced with a form appearing too sharp, too planar, it's usually because the form is lacking in volume. Even if it's not lacking in volume, addition of clay is usually a better solution that leads to a more pleasing look. Think of any high point on your sculpture as the top of a mountain. One side of the mountain catches the light, and the other catches the shadow. If the transition between light and dark seems too sharp, the answer is not to grind down the mountaintop, because then your sculpture is going to become flat, which we don't want. Flat work is boring work. So instead, we are going to round off the slopes of the mountain. We'll turn the mountain from a sharp peak into a rounded mound, without ever touching the peak of the mountain. Rule number 1 applies as well, so we are not going to expand our mountain. We'll keep its borders and we'll keep its height. We're just going to make it a bit more of a pleasant experience riding your bike over it by rounding it off, so the transition between up and down is not so stark, not so intense. Rule number 3 is very simple. Rule number 3 is addition of clay is always preferable to removal of clay. Sculpture as a medium has one thing going for it as compared to painting, which has many things going for it. Painters have color, atmosphere, background, contrast. They have a bunch of tools to play with to create their illusions. Sculptors have one thing to work with, and that one thing is space. So as a sculptor, to take advantage of your only tool and utilize as much space as you can get away with is preferable. A sculpture that lacks in volume will always appear flat and boring. It will be lacking in values. Imagine a painting painted with values very close to each other. It would appear very grey looking and nothing would pop out. In sculpture, the same thing can happen if your volumes do not catch a full range of values, all the way from light to dark. The only way we can expand on the value range appearing on our work's surface is by making sure we add more clay, more volume. A sculpture sculpted with this way of thinking as a consideration tends to look better than one where the consideration of volume has not been made. Michelangelo's work is a good example. It has a lot of volume, and that's one of the reasons why it stands out and looks so good. Obviously, we have to work within reason. You can't just apply volume at random and hope it will make your figure better, which is why I outlined the 3 rules above, as it gives me a bit of a guideline, and you, hopefully, a bit of a guideline to work within. Sometimes I have to break these rules, of course, in order to get the effect that I'm after. But in general, these 3 rules are decent guidelines to follow, and they won't lead you down a bad path, if nothing else. While doing this work, a key thing that's not really captured here on the video, because it's a little bit boring, is the constant stepping back and evaluation of what I'm doing. Only from a distance can I make an educated decision on whether what I've done fit into the whole. Up close, something might appear to look very good, but when we step back and take the whole into consideration, it does not. Each part has a role to play and it needs to fit into the whole, and the only place you can judge the whole from is from a distance. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, consider liking it and subscribing to the channel for more videos. I put out a new video every Thursday, so stay tuned for next week. If you want to support the channel, visit the link to my Patreon page in the description below to learn how. Thank you for watching, stay creative, and I hope to see you in the next one.